Hey everybody, how is it going? Welcome back to the final week of this Hands-On with Maxon Cinema 4D Beginners Workshop. And as always, I'm joined with Matt. How's it going, Matt?
It's going okay. I can't believe this is our last week already.
I know. How quickly has 6 weeks gone? It's been a lot of fun though. Like we've really enjoyed it. Cool. So I'll do my usual little introduction here. Really quickly, can everybody see my screen? And do we sound
Yes.
do we sound good? Do we look all good?
You sound all right. We look amazing, but that's beside the point.
Okay, cool. So for anyone who is new, the idea of this sort of hands-on workshop is to get everyone comfortable in Cinema 4D in just 6 weeks. Me and Matt, we broke this down into 6 different topics. And yeah, as we said, this is the final week where we look through all things to do with rendering. But if you guys haven't seen any of those weeks or kind of have missed watching the live version of that, we did actually record them and we do have an unlisted playlist on YouTube. So if any of you need that and haven't been able to find it, just let us know and then we can link it in the chat. We can also link it to you guys in response to a question. So if you don't have access to the chat, 'cause I know sometimes people may not, just let us know in the questions and we can send that over, as well as a link to all the project files for the entire 6 weeks. So yes, we're all sad. This is the final week. I've got my little crying emoji here because we can't believe it's coming to an end. So let's take a look at what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to look at all things to do with rendering. And so we're going to start off by looking at how we can actually render inside of Cinema 4D using the standard and physical renderers. So some people who are completely new to Cinema 4D may not know we actually have 2 renderers inside of Cinema 4D, and those are the standard and physical. Because I know we talk a lot about Redshift, Maxon talks a lot about Redshift because we're all part of the same group now, but there are actually renderers within the software natively that we can use. We're also going to understand what ambient occlusion is and global illumination. So we looked a little bit at global illumination in week 3 when we looked at HDRI lighting and stuff like that. So we're going to look at how we can switch those on in our render settings and how they affect our renders, not only kind of visually, but also how it can affect render times. And we're going to look at how we can kind of get a nice balance between kind of quality and time. That's what it's all about, really. We're also going to develop an understanding of the render settings inside of Cinema and the differences for rendering stills versus animations. So there's some things that you might want to switch on. There's also things like format settings and setting up your frames for things like animation. And then we're going to take a little look at some additional kind of extras, things like depth of field, post effects, and post effects is in Redshift, and then also magic bullet looks. And then finally, we're going to learn how to set up multipasses or AOVs. And so normally, those of you who have been part of these sessions with us or have seen the recordings, we kind of split this like a half and half. So we do a bit of like a technical and we do a bit of practical. However, this session is a little bit different because rendering is a topic where it's not kind of, we're not learning like specific tools as such in Cinema 4D. We thought instead of doing like a practical version which might be a little bit challenging, we're going to take that time and I'm going to show you guys a little bit about Redshift. So we're going to have a look at some settings, lights and node materials, and this will be handy for those of you who do have Redshift, those of you who maybe have it but haven't started using it yet, because it can be I don't know, like node materials could be a little bit daunting perhaps, or those of you who are maybe like considering using Redshift, this is going to be handy. But don't worry, majority of the session will be on standard and physical, because I know that's what majority of you guys are using. So shall we get started? Also, hi to everyone saying hey in the chat. Hey to Mark, Jonathan, Scott, Drake, Daniel, Greg, look, all you guys in there, all the regulars, and anyone new as well. Yeah, welcome to that. Don't forget, as always, let us know any of your questions. So Matt's gonna show us some amazing stuff inside of Cinema 4D now, all things to do with rendering. So if you guys have any questions, he and I will be more than happy to answer them for you.
I don't think I can. What I'm about to show can be constituted as amazing this time. Unfortunately, it's
It's super
required and a
useful stuff
necessity, but it's wouldn't define it as wonderfully fun at this point.
to
Okay, so are you throwing? There we go. You are.
I am, yes, yeah.
So
But it's
you
gonna be
can see
amazing
my.
stuff to know. This sort of like rounds off all of this, like 6 weeks of beginner's knowledge. This is kind of that final step to give everyone like the confidence to then just go make some of your own stuff inside cinema and render it.
Okay, so let's have a look inside the render settings for Cinema 4D, which you can find up here in the cogwheel. The cogwheel little film clacker, and that brings us up to our render settings. Don't be too scared by it. You know, there's quite a bit here, but there's quite a few useful things that you guys need to know. I'm not going to go through every single possible tab because we could be here forever. I'm going to go through the ones that I think you guys need to know to get up and running. The first one is the renderer. This is the important one because this allows you to choose which renderer you're going to use. By default, there are the two external renderers of sorts, and then there is the viewport renderer. Of course, I've got Redshift installed as well. So this is where I choose my renderer. The viewport renderer is exactly as it sounds. It is a renderer of the viewport. So if I create my cube, which for some reason is taking forever to, there we go, view, and then I click this button, which is the render to picture viewer, which we've looked at before, it will do a render of the picture viewer. Now, this is quite useful for doing play blasts and preview animations and things like that, and just quickly seeing if things are coming out okay. Or if you've done a render here that you are happy with, or you know, a look that you can just quickly export that out as, and it will work with the settings that you have in your viewport, or you can potentially choose different viewports and different viewport settings and different operations down here. So if, for example, let's just create a floor really quickly. Hello, floor. There we go. You know, if I was to turn on, just leave it very simple on there, but I could turn on ambient occlusion, which we're getting to, in my viewport, and in my filters here, I could turn off the work plane. So if I now do a preview render, I've got ambient occlusion, but my work plane has gone. So it's quite useful to be able to set up your viewport render slightly differently from your actual viewport. So you can render out stuff that you do or do not want to be, or do not have to keep turning it on and off in the viewport in order to do it. So that's the viewport render. It renders what you see in the viewport. Now let's have a look at standard. The standard renderer is exactly that. It's the one that was basically coded with Cinema 4D from the beginning, and it's got various settings that we need to look through to make sure we watch what we do when we export. So let's go to output, and output is exactly that. This is what do I want to output. At the moment, it's a preset of 1280 by 720. We've got this little drop down triangle here, and we've got various presets you can use. So stuff for screen, 1K, 2, 3, and 4. You've got film and video from HD TV, PAL, NTSC, Ultra HD, woohoo, 8K, good grief. Even mobile devices and things. Is it still there? No, the little Apple iPod has disappeared finally. That was there for quite some time. But you've also got print as well, which is quite useful. So if you want to make sure that I'm doing an A3 print, you can see that my thing changes. I've got the safe frames either side, so that a grey that says this is not what will be rendered, this will be rendered in the middle, and it's also set automatically to 300 dots per inch DPI, so that you know that when you export you're going to get quite a good print. You can of course increase this and it will increase render times, as you can increase the height. You can work in centimeters, millimeters, inches if you really want to go picas, points and pixels. So you don't have to be stuck with these for exactly what you want. You can choose other things. So depending on what your output is, this is where you would choose it. So if I was doing an animation, I would probably choose, where am I going? HD TV 2997. And that means that I've now got a standard sort of screen ratio. You can lock the ratio, you can choose your resolution. Most of these things I'm going to ignore. Film aspects, those I'm going to ignore. Frame rate as well, obviously you can change to 30 or 25, 23, depending on what it is that you want to do. Frame rate is where something that Elly picked up on the other time. This is what it is I'm going to render. So if I just ever so quickly animate my cube, ooh, what did I do? Dink, dink, bloop, bloop, bloop. If I'm on this frame and I choose current frame and I render, that's the frame that it will render. So wherever my time slider is, if I'm on frame 30 and then I press render and I'm on current frame, that is exactly what it will render. So current frame will always reference the time scrubber along the bottom. You can choose all frames, which will of course do all frames of your animation. So if your animation is 1,000 frames long or 20,000 frames long, and you've actually only animated 100 frames of it, it will render out the whole thing, which is fine if that's what you want it to do. But if you want to just be aware of the from and to steps. You can also choose preview range. This preview range is this bar here. Now, because my animation is only 90 frames long, this bar takes up the entire thing. Whereas if I use the right-hand side and I scrub it down, this is a preview range that I can choose where I'm looking at. And that's new, look at that. You can see that my animation track is showing which part of the animation that actually entails. That's quite clever, I like that. So my preview range, as you can see, is now from frame 13 to 51. And if I move that over there, it's now from 35 to 73. Or of course, you can choose manual and do whatever you like. So I could do frame to that to 68 if I wanted to. And that's completely manual, which is ignoring all frames. It's ignoring my animation length and it's ignoring my preview range, which I can just double click to re-extend. Okay, so that is the output. That is choosing what it is that we are going to, or how we are outputting rather. Underneath is the save box. And this is where are we going to save it? It's got a tick in the box. It's got a big blank space here. And if I press my 3 dots, then it will say, where do you want to save it? And I'm going to be naughty and save it to my desktop. And I'm going to say animation. This is the important part. So this fills it out. You can't just put the name in there. You actually have to choose the location so that it's got the full file path. This is the important bit. You need to choose your format. So if I'm doing an animation and I just want to do a quick animation that's not going to take very long as I would do here, then I can choose one of the 2 animation formats available to me, which is MOV and MP4, because I'm on a Mac. So I've got the MOV option. If you don't and you leave it as a TIFF, then it will render out every single frame of your animation as an individual TIFF file, which is fine if that's what you want it to do, because then you can use Premiere or After Effects to then comp those all together. If you don't mean to do that and you do a schoolboy error, like someone I know who's on the webcam call with me at the moment did today, then you accidentally fill your entire desktop with TIFF files and you didn't mean to.
Why have you just outed me?
Because I've done it so many times.
We spoke about it the other day. That's why I thought it was so funny that I just did it.
It happens. You can forget. You can do all of the planning, you can do everything that you mean to, and that is the one to check. So if you wonder one time when you've got a desktop full of images, this is probably what you've done. We've all done it and we continue to do it. So there's no problem there. So I'm going to choose MP4 because that's the one that I'm going to use. There are actually advantages to doing it TIFF by TIFF, particularly if you live somewhere that's got dodgy power, or you're running the risk of your machine overheating. Because if I've got a 10,000 long frame animation and I'm rendering an MP4 or a MOV and it dies on frame 9,998, I've lost my entire animation because it's corrupted the file and can't finish it. It's incredibly annoying. If you have rendered out as the individual TIFFs, then the only frame you will have lost is the one it was rendering at the time of it crashing, power dying, aliens invading your living room or whatever. So it's really actually a very useful save for ensuring that you don't lose work and hours of rendering. And then, as I say, you can just use After Effects or Premiere to comp it all together and make it work. So the choice is yours. Yeah, and you can just use MP4, which is what I'm going to do for my incredible animation of my cube moving from left to right. Multipass we will get to. Anti-aliasing. Now, this is one of those things that we all actually are probably aware of, anybody that uses a screen, but either didn't know what it's called or what it actually does. You will notice that when you do things on a screen, certainly in Cinema 4D's interface, that the lines of cubes and straight lines in diagonals are actually made up of tiny little steps. This is because you are sitting in front of a computer screen that is rows and rows of pixels. It doesn't know how to do a diagonal line from there to there, so technically it's little rows of slight diagonals, of slight horizontal lines. That's all very well and good, but that's not the way life works. So that's not the way we want things to render. So we need to turn on anti-aliasing, which gets rid of it. And if you're ever going to do an animation, choose best. Or an image, to be honest, choose best. I wouldn't mess around with minimum and maximum levels too much, because that can slow your render times down catastrophically, especially if you choose 16 by 16. So be aware of that. Filter. At the moment, this is depending on what you're trying to do. So either go for cubic if you're going to do it for a still image, or gauze if you're going to do an animation. So let's choose that, and that will soften. What that effectively does is bleed the pixels over either side of the squares so that it fuzzes the line and makes it not so stepped. Yeah, that's that one. So that's anti-aliasing. Options. Now, this is, most of the time, you're probably going to need to look at this at all, but it is quite useful to know, as you can very quickly turn off transparency, refraction, reflection, and shadow, things like that, boom, 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 without having to go into each of your individual materials and turn them off. I can just go, I don't want refraction in this one, or reflection, or shadows, or whatever. There's all sorts of other things that you've got in there, turning textures on and off, turning off and on, volumetric lighting, rendering the HUD or not, rendering the doodle, if you remember that I did the doodle last week for something I was doing. But most of these you can just leave alone, to be perfectly honest. Something over here, however, may be worth noting, and that's probably the reflection depth. If in real life I was to put a mirror either side of my head and I was to look, that reflection goes on forever. Okay, that's the way light bounces and reflections work. You know, we're all aware that it continues to do that. In Cinema 4D, with this setting, it will bounce 5 times and then it will stop. So the 5th or 6th mirror would be black because it would simply stop bouncing. If you want to see examples of this, right click and go to Show Help. And then it will take me to this wonderful example of different types of ray depth. And you can see that this is a very low ray depth, so I can't even see through the transparency of this sphere here with an alpha on it. It doesn't bounce reflection at all. This is a ray depth of 4, so now I can see that it's bouncing a bit on the outside, but I am not getting the true visibility of this. And yet on the final one, when I've got 8, I'm getting the way I would expect it, which is visibles and throughs. And here is the example of that mirror going backwards and forwards with a ray depth of 2, bounce, bounce, stop. With a ray depth of 4, bounce, 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 stop. And then with a ray depth of 8, bounce, bounce, I'm not going to do all 8 bounces, and then stop so far that you can't actually see it, which is fine. And shadow depth is very similar. So you've got very few bounces. It's still doing all of the reflections, but the shadows stop after 2 bounces and then 4 bounces and then 8 bounces. So this is something to be aware of. If you're getting lack of reflections, if you've got multiple things, or ray depth and shadow issues, then they're there. It doesn't matter if you increase them, because I don't think it actually, if it doesn't need to calculate it, it won't calculate it. So if you haven't got 15 mirrors going backwards and forwards, it doesn't matter that this is at 15. It won't make it be any slower. Most of that, as I say, is very, very rare that I come into this and change anything, to be perfectly honest. So, but it's useful to know what they do. Stereoscopic, I'm just not going into. Unless anybody is doing any 3D VR stuff, this is completely irrelevant for you. Team render, you can also largely ignore. That's our network rendering thing that we've got that comes with most subscriptions. Material override is an interesting one, because what that does is that overrides all of the materials in your scene for a standard one. So imagine that we've done our lovely shelves and we've put all of our materials and we've got them all exactly where we want. And then your client says, can I see what they look like with no materials, please? You could just Control A and delete and then pray that you don't accidentally save over the file that's got all the materials in the right place. Or you can turn on material override, beep, and then you say, right, here is my white material. This is the material I want you to use. And now all of my renders will have that white material. Oh, no, I'm rendering all sorts of stuff. Let's cancel that. So that's something to be useful. And you can choose whether or not it overrides or whether it preserves the diffuse color or luminance bump. So you can have a white material, but if you've got bump on any of the channels, then it will remain. So you will still get that kind of texture, but it will just be a white material. But that's something that's kind of useful. Magic bullet looks we will get to in a bit. So with all of that set up, so I've got my output set where I want, I've got, let's choose it to all frames, bang, there we go, I've got it doing. I go into my save, I'm saving as an MP4 and I'm not going to fill my desktop with TIFF files. Anti-aliasing is set to best. Options, I've not changed anything because I don't need to. Now I can just close that. There's no save, as there's no okay, there's no anything with your render settings, because your render settings is a nodal idea. It can be wherever you like it. So you just change things that you want to, and it can stay in your viewport. You don't have to click OK. You don't have to click agree or save my settings or whatever. It's just there. However, if you do want to save your settings, you can go to render, and then I can say save preset, and I can save it as a preset of my render preset animation MP4. Okay, so that's now what that one is called, and I'm just going to rename that as well. Animation. Whoop. Because what I can do in the same scene file, I can create a new animation settings. And if I go to this one, and I can swap between those two. So if I look at my output, here is the one that I've set because it's HD TV, and my render setting here is a reset one, so it's back to 0. It will still, the only one it's going to use is whichever one it is toggled on the left hand side, but which one I'm editing is the one that is highlighted orange. So let's make it, let's say this one I'm going to do an image, so I'm going to make this one an A4 print. My anti-aliasing I'm going to set to best. I'm going to set that to cube, which is fine. Output will be current frame. Okay, so that means whichever one I'm in, that's fine. And then I choose my save, and then I choose where I'm going to put it, and I'm going to call it still. And I'm going to make sure I stay on a TIFF, which is fine. And now I have, if I can call that still, if I render an output, I'll render a still there. If I select that one, then I'll render the animation from the camera's point of view. So I can have multiple setups here, which is really useful in a single file, so I don't have to create another file in order to do it. And again, I can save that one if I want to, and save a preset, load a preset. So that's I'm on the animation. Let's call that one. Let's save presets, call that still. And now under my render settings, I've got load presets, animation still, boom, boom, boom. And I can choose and add them into different files later on. So that is render settings for standard render. And then depending on what I want to do, obviously, if I press that, that just renders the viewport as we've discovered before. If I click here, that renders to picture viewer, and if I click yes, it will now overwrite the last one. And you get to then watch the picture viewer create all of my individual frames, telling me how long it's taken for each frame, which is less than a second, which is incredible. You can see that everything is slowly moving on. You can see the little square buckets desperately trying to figure out everything and get everything where they need to be. I'm just going to delete that one because it's in the way. Remove image, bye-bye. There we go. And so now I've got ding, 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 the ones that I all had before in the picture viewer, and then my animation, you can see it's slowly doing, well, rather quickly doing all of the frames. I can even press play as it's done it, and then it will get to wherever it's got to and repeat. And, oh, we're nearly there. One more run, and the animation is complete. There we go. And so now I have all 90 frames of my animation there in my picture viewer to view, and on my desktop, providing that I've got the right setting, I have an animation of my cube. Whee! Okay. And if I wanted to do something slightly differently, let's say I want to now render a still frame. So if I press still, it's got all of the settings, it's on the current frame, press that, it will now render my incredibly exciting piece of artwork there. There we go. I might stick that on an Instagram and do one of those renders every day for 15 years. And there I have my TIFF file. Okay, are there any questions on render settings thus far?
Yes, we've got a couple. Yeah, I wanted to wait until a good point, but we've got, yeah, a few of them. So first things first, Jonathan was wondering, can you render with alpha channels?
Yes, you can. So if I put my mouse in the right place and create a new file, put a cube there, and if I, in my scene, turn on alpha channel, that will create an alpha channel embedded in this image because there is nothing in the background. So if I just do a quick render, which I can do, by the way, with not having any of those settings, but the moment I close Cinema 4D, this image will cease to exist. So it's, if you're going to want to save an image, it's always important to make sure you do the settings that I just did to start with.
Or you
However,
can go file save.
Sorry?
If you forget, you can go file save,
Yeah.
because
You can right click and save image as,
forget to do things.
or file and save image that way. But what you can also see here under my layers, I have an alpha channel, multipass, single pass. There you go. I've got an alpha channel and a single channel, and they will export as a single image if I want them to, based on my settings. If I wanted a separate one, I could choose separate.
Cool, thanks. Okay, let me have a look. Can you specify certain frames? For example, let's say you wanted to render frame 1, 5, and 12. So not necessarily kind of like 1 to 12, but like sporadic ones.
I don't think you can. I think that's something that's been asked for a long time, and I don't think it's something we've ever actually integrated. If they have, I've completely forgotten how to do it.
It doesn't look like it.
I don't think you can.
Cool. There we go then. Okay, so cool. So at frame rate 29.97, and you render a sequence of files, for example, 300 PNGs, how does it handle the fractions?
I don't know. that's more beyond me. For some reason, you render out the number of frames that you need, so you will get effectively all of the frames that you have. They will just be played back faster in whatever program it is that you use, I think.
Yeah. Cool. Cool, yeah, a little one here. If you render from After Effects, does it matter which renderer you choose within Cinema 4D?
Not necessarily, because technically you are using Cinema 4D's renderer, whichever one you do, because After Effects is actually channeling Cinema 4D through the Cineware plugin. It depends on what how you want it to look, but it will use whichever one you set, I think. I don't know how that works with Redshift. I know it with standard and physical, it will work with whichever one you choose.
Yeah, I've not tried it with Redshift.
Ooh.
I tend to I render out of Cinema 4D, then take into After Effects. That's what I do. Kent was wondering, will you be covering tokens for rendering?
I wasn't going to, because I've never used them, but I know of them. They exist over here. They are additional, like, tiny programming language things that basically say, okay, I'm going to choose from my animation test, and this will render test. Now, I could also choose that it would render test and then the computer name. So it will do $, and then it will call computer. So when I press render here, it would, in theory, create an image if I was to save it somewhere. Uses demo desktop that has my computer name in it as well. Or you can choose the date, the camera that you use, and that's really quite useful if you use the take system, which I'm not going through either. So that you can choose, yeah, I want you to have the test, and then I want you to be called camera number, whatever, and the take number, so that I will get named files based on certain aspects that I don't have to program. So any render from that camera will be called camera that render. Any render from that one will be called that one, and it allows you to differentiate all sorts of things. As you can see, these are all the different types of things that I can pick, and you just choose it. So I could just click that one, take, and I don't have to stick with one either. I can do take, and then I can then do year that it was done, frame rate, author, document, project name. So project, take number, and then the computer that it was done on, and it will render that for you.
Cool, thanks. A
That's
couple
right.
more. Can you set up a render queue like you can in After Effects?
Yes, you can. You need to make sure that you save your file. So if I try and go to render queue now, it will moan at me because it will say, you haven't saved your file, and it will bring this up. So let's call this cube. And there is my render queue with my cube file in it. And then I can open a new project. So let's add that one that Jonas gave us the other day. And then I can choose whether it renders, whether it doesn't, add the files, add a current project, and then just press the play button, and then it will start rendering. So it will work its way through all of the things until it's done. If there's anything that doesn't work because it can't find textures or errors, then it will tell you, and it will say, no, can't render here because you've not specified it, or the output file is wrong, or something like that.
Cool. Let me have a look. How do you bring up the menu that includes render setting preset options?
I just went down here. When I went to render settings and I went load preset, there was just the two that I had saved. So you watched me save them, and then they appear under load. So it's the render settings here, load, and then they'll only appear there if you've saved some.
Dan was saying that's a minimal desktop, but it's your demo one, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, this is my demo machine.
Just very minimal at work.
Yeah, I just take everything and I shove it in a folder. You should see my normal one.
Greg was wondering, can you render a Z-depth map version?
Yeah, not that I know how to do.
No.
So not from me. It might be possible. But I don't know how to do that. So I'll have to pass on that one, I'm afraid.
That's fine, that's not a problem. I know you weren't too keen on showing this, but Jonathan was asking about motion blur settings.
Right, okay. Shall we come back to that one?
Yeah.
Because it will make sense to do it as part of the physical side as well, which I'll get to in a minute. So I'll
Okay.
carry on with looking at AO and GI, and then
Yeah. So we have one more question.
Okay.
And then I'll let you I'll let you carry on.
Oh, thank you.
So the final one is, see, I don't know this either, so you might. Is there a checkbox to skip already rendered frames?
No,
Like override or skip options for a sequence?
no, that's also something that's been wanted for a while, in the same vein of being able to choose frames from rendered frames 2 to 5 and then 8 to 7. Skip already made frames is another one that unfortunately we just don't have.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Well, any other questions, guys? Just let us know, and yeah, we'll get to them.
Okay, so carrying on with some of these then. Let's just, I'm going to file a new just because it makes everywhere clear. Of course, something that we have looked at a few times is ambient occlusion and global illumination. You know, they're really useful effects that we can add. So ambient occlusion, I'm just going to add that. I'm not going to go into too much depth because we have looked at it already. But what ambient occlusion does is it fakes the principle that light gets trapped in corners. Because of the way that light bounces off things, if you've got a corner, less light escapes than like a normal flat surface. So light kind of gets trapped and fizzles out, which means that in general, light or corners, crevices are darker wherever you look. This fakes that principle by basically overlaying a gradient on top of something wherever there is right angles or nooks or crevices and things like that. And this is what it does. It goes from 0 to 100, black to transparent, basically. 0, minimum ray depth of 0, maximum 100. So with this on, if I press render, whoop, you see I now have this, that it's harsh gradient here, and it actually fades out to about there. It's just very subtle because of the way it works. I can change that and then re-render, and of course it's going to go a little bit crazy. Lots of very dark, which of course is not very useful at all, but at least you can see what it's actually trying to do. These are two useful settings because depending on the size that you have your object. I have known someone gone, well, I don't know why, but all of my renders are black. Every time I do something, it's completely black. And I said, can you send me the file, please? I need to figure out what's going on. And it's because the maximum ray depth was set so high that basically the entire of his scene was in this part of the gradient. So everything was horrifically dark. So if you're doing something based on size, or you've shrunk it, so if this is, for example, 0 to 100, that's fine if my cube is 2 meters. If my cube is 2 centimeters, then this might be a little bit off. So if I did 2 by 2 by 2, and now I have a look at this, and I move it, I move the floor up. Let's move the floor up. Not that, there we go. And now I render that, it's going to be much darker, and it doesn't seem like it's doing what it should do because all of this is really grainy for the same principle, which is that I don't really want the maximum ray depth to be 100, ray length to be 100, if everything I'm doing is going to be super tiny. So if I just tidy that up, There we go, that looks much cleaner, and all of the noise has disappeared from the outside. So that is something to be very, very much aware of. Transparency will allow you to do things if there are any transparent materials in it. Self-shadowing only means that it will only create shadows on itself. So you can see I've re-rendered that and I have got no ambient occlusion where it was on the floor. So I'm just going to create my bog standard ambient occlusion device. And now if I render that, I've got ambient occlusion occurring on the inside, but not on the floor because of self-shadowing only. And if I turn that back off, it will do the shadow there and the shadow on the floor. So that is a nice way of creating fake shadows, fake detail and depth using ambient occlusion. Global illumination is the other one that we looked at. And this is what we discussed before. It's figuring out how light actually bounces, and it's forcing Cinema 4D to understand that light bounces. So if I turn this on and render, you'll be very surprised to see that my scene is completely black because I have nothing creating any form of light. It needs some form of light source, be that a light or a sky, an HDR, all those sorts of things. So if I just create sky, even though I don't have a material on it, if I press render, it will create a light source. All of these little gray points are photons that Cinema 4D is firing from the sky, trying to figure out how light bounces, and then it will create my lit render. I've still got ambient occlusion in on there, so I'm getting a little bit of the darkening in corners to make something a bit more presentable, I guess, is the way of looking at it. I'm not going to say realistic, but that's up to you. Under the global illuminations, there are a load of drop downs for presets. So if you're going to do an interior or an exterior or high quality, low quality, you can choose this. If you're going for preview visualization or object visualization, these are the things that you can choose. So you can see that anything that's like interior high will choose irradiance cache and irradiance cache. Object visualization previews will be irradiance cache and light mapping, various different arrays of sampling settings. You can have a look and see how they're all set up. You can tweak them all individually by going into each of these individual tabs and then choosing how you want these to work. I'm not going to go into depth on these. It's not really something you can cover in a beginner's course to talk about the difference between irradiance cache and light maps and those sorts of things. If you're interested in knowing what they do, right click on them, go to show help, and then have a look at all of the difference with primaries and secondaries, and all of the difference between the one that I supposedly is the best, Quasi Monte Carlo. I don't name these things, I just use them. But this is an incredibly in-depth help file about the way it creates all sorts of stuff and the differences and what settings can do and how light bounces. And this is basically a theory lesson in a book as part of our manual. So enjoy that and let me know how you get on. But that is global illumination and ambient occlusion. Is there a good time to stop there? Do we have any questions, or shall I now go into physical renderer?
Do you know, we haven't really got any questions. Someone was asking about something being possible with inner corners and edges, but I just asked what kind of setting that was relating to.
Okay.
I wasn't too sure
Okay.
what you were showing as that question came in. But when that comes in, I'll let you know. But yeah, you can go straight into physical.
Let's go to the physical renderer. So up here, as we said before, render at standard, changing to render at physical. There are a few tiny things that change. Most of this are the same, so I'm not going to go through it. So the output is the same, the save is the same, the multipass, which are we covering? Didn't I cover that the other day? I swear I covered it in one of the lessons, but if not, we'll go through it again quickly. Anti-aliasing changes. So it basically says you can't have a physical renderer, a more physically accurate render, and not have anti-aliasing on. So it's tough. It's grayed out because it's definitely on. The only thing you can choose is the type. That's fine. Everything else is the same when it comes to options. stereoscopic and team render material O drive, except I now have a physical tab. And this physical tab allows me to choose a couple of more options up here, which is depth of field and motion blur. Now, depth of field used to be really difficult to set up. I mean, it does exist under standard renderer as an effect that you can add somewhere there, depth of field. Don't. It doesn't really work properly. What it does, the depth of field for the standard renderer is it goes, what object do you want to be in focus, sort of, and then blurs the front and blurs the foreground and blurs the background, kind of a bit like rendering them in 3 different ways and shoving them in Photoshop and doing exactly the same thing. So it's not great to work with. However, physical renderer gives me depth of field. And depth of field is much more physically accurate, funnily enough, in the physical renderer. So let's create something super fast that's going to give me depth of field. Bang. Ta-da. Okay, so there is my super exciting depth of field scene. It's thrilling, isn't it? I told you this would be an exceptionally exciting one. To make this work with physical renderer, you need a camera. Okay, so you must create a camera up here. And then let's look through that camera to make sure that we are using that. Otherwise, we won't, and then things will become very confusing. So I've made my camera and I'm looking through it. Under physical, I can now choose levels of exposure and f-stops and shutter speeds and all sorts of things like that, exactly the way you can do with a real camera. I go crazy, so I'll do 0.1 to start with, just so that I can see what it is or is not doing, and then I'll tweak it from there on in. Nothing's happened, you say. This is because I haven't turned on depth of field in my viewport. So I can render it and it will, wow, that's blurry. I really need my eye tested sort of blur, isn't it? But what we can do, I can actually view this in my viewport. So I can go to options and I can go to depth of field, and it'll at least give me a preview. God, that makes me feel drunk. That shows that this is doing some form of depth of field. Now, where it is focusing on is dealt with under the camera, under the object, as a focal distance, which you can increase and decrease, and you can see that stuff is coming into and out of focus. Now, that's all very well and good, but I have a little trick that I use, which is I create a null object, whoop, and then under my camera's focus object, I drag and drop the null, which now means I can use my null object to focus where I want my camera. And clearly that f-stop is ridiculous. So let's just use 1. And now I'm getting a much more subtle fade in, blur in and blur out. And it's all done with the control of the null object. And I can render the viewport and we can see what it's like. So where is it in focus? Where is it not? And it blurs out. And that very quickly is depth of field. So you need to make sure that depth of field on is on in your render settings, that you have a camera that is set to physical, and that you change your f-stop so that at least you can see where it is focusing upon. That's my very brief explanation of depth of field. Motion blur is a very quick one. So let's not do it there. Let's do it from 0 to 30. And I'm going to make my animation 30 frames. And don't forget to turn this to physical and turn on motion blur. And this is the number of motion subdivisions. So this, for motion blur, is subframe rendering. Okay, there are things that go so fast in real life that when a camera is capturing them, it's going so fast that it is a blur because it has moved in such a long span between one frame and another that it can't capture the whole thing. So it looks like it's blurring. Helicopter blades, those sorts of things. What this does is it works out where it is on that frame, and then the difference spread, like the number of subdivisions, that it blurs in between those frames and overlays it as a single frame. So one frame all of a sudden has multiple kind of overlaid images of it. Let me just see if I can show you by doing this. It might not be going fast enough. You can see, look, you can see it's blurring. So what it is doing, it is taking positions either side of the set keyframe where it is and then blurring them to give the effect that this is moving so fast that the camera cannot capture it. Which is going to look very odd for a cube moving 1 foot from one side to another, but nonetheless, that's how you turn the settings on in order to use something for like a helicopter blades. So now if I press play, woo, look at that, so fast it's blurry. Needs a couple of go faster stripes on it. And that's pretty much it, really. That again used to be a lot more hassle to deal with, and there is depth, there is, I think, motion blur under the standard renderer. No, there's not. Is there not? I thought there used to be. Maybe it's gone. So under the physical renderer, motion blur, you can increase the number of blurrings with that depending on how much you want, how smooth you want your blurred animation to be. And they're the only real differences between standard and physical when it comes to the render settings as such. The physical renderer is designed to be more physically accurate. So there are certain things that it will do better than the standard renderer will, and adding in fakes. Okay, any questions on those so far then?
So no questions on that, but we have got 2 questions still relating to rendering.
Okay.
But yeah, if anyone has any questions on anything to do with physical or AO or anything like that, just yeah, let us know. So Ryan was wondering, how do you render without the sky HDR image? So could you show
that one's an easy one.
Yeah, in the settings.
Alright. So if I've got a cube and I've got a sky and I find some form of HDRI, and I've got my lovely sunny park. Is that the sunny park that I think it is? I think so. What you can do, and obviously if you render, I'm getting the lighting effect, of course. If I put myself on physical, I might turn on global illumination. I get a lovely illuminated effect of my cube being slightly green and everything around the outside, which is great, wonderful lighting, but I don't want to see the sky in the background. What I can do on my sky object, I go to tags, render tags, compositing. And on this compositing tag, I have the ability of turning off scene by camera. Boop. That means that now when I render, it doesn't show, but the cube is still illuminated the same way. So sky, the object you want to change, the tag is a compositing tag. And of course, you can see there's a whole host of other things that I can do. I can turn off shadows, I can turn on casting shadows, turn off camera, turn off reflection, ambient occlusion, transparency, all sorts of things like that. But the only one I'm dealing with is scene by camera at this point.
Thanks. So I kind of have like the opposite question. How do you render objects with a background PNG included?
Oh,
I guess there's a couple of ways.
Yeah, the way I would probably do it if you wanted a set background PNG would be to go up here and create a background object. Dunk. And then choose the image for that background object. So depending on, I mean, this is going to look really weird if I do that because it's going to be a 360-degree image spread on something. But that's what I would use, and then it doesn't matter wherever I'm looking because this is a background object as a PNG. So then I can press that and press render, and now the cube, well, I've got ambient occlusion, global illumination on, haven't I? Dunk. So I can make it look really realistically like this cube is sitting in the middle of this park.
Sometimes I use a like a plane and then attach it to, you know, like the camera, so so it's always kind of facing the camera, and then drop in a little PNG
that's another
on there.
one. I've done that quite a few times as well. So depending on what I'm trying to do and the angle that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
And then let's move it back. And if you make a camera and then make the plane the child of the camera, wherever you look around, ooh, that failed. Look in the camera, make a plane the child of the camera, look in the camera, and then move that around. Then you've kind of always got that plane there as a cheat. The moment I come out of that camera, you can see that it's just an effect on the back of that. So there's a couple of ways of doing it depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Cool, thanks. Is the default camera compatible with Redshift and vice versa? Or I'm sort of more referring to the depth of field settings. So you can set up, yes, so basically a Redshift standard camera is a Cinema 4D camera with a Redshift camera tag on it. So if you click that Redshift camera tag, and then so here is where you then have your depth of field settings. So in bokeh, if you click that, it's a case of kind of overriding and enable it, and then you can adjust your focus settings. But this also is still relating to the settings inside the camera. So you still have to make sure in here you're adjusting your shutter speed, f-stop, and your focus kind of point or distance. They work side by side. So basically, when you go into the Redshift settings under cameras, if you click a standard camera, it is a Cinema 4D camera with a Redshift camera tag on. So yeah.
There we go. Thank you for that one.
That's okay. Cool. Yeah, I think that's all the questions we've had for now.
Okay. Which case I've got multi-passes left to do, haven't I? And then
just like a brief look at Magic Bullet looks.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and then whatever time is left, I'll fill with some joys about
Redshift. That's it. Okay. So multi-passes is the ability of rendering out your scene of Cinema 4D in different layers depending on things that you want to be able to tweak later. This could be shadows, the actual object, cutting it out from the background, all the way up to having your materials reflection on a different layer that you can tone up and tone down depending on how crazy you want to make it. So let's create a simple scene. Let's go to cube, let's do on fillet, let's do that. Let's create a sphere, let's put it there, and let's create a cone and put it there. You can see that my 3D modeling and composition skills know no bounds. Let's create a super shiny material. Should have gone GGX really. Let's put that on there. Let's create a maybe not so super shiny, but still that with Fresnel and that under there, making it red, pink, red. Turn off color. Don't forget to turn off color. Did I turn off color on the other one? I didn't. Whoops. There we go. And then let's go for another. No, yeah. Boom. So I now have 3 very different materials in a scene, and I have no lights. So I need to make sure that I have a light in my scene at the very least, and I'm going to create an Umney light, which puts it in the middle. Create that over there. And then I'm going to turn on shadows and just render the bliss that is my scene. There we go, absolutely amazing. Never before have I created such a masterpiece. So let's have a look at multipass rendering. Over here, obviously we choose our renderer, what we're going to do. I'm just going to stick with standard. We choose our output, don't really care about all of that right now. Save, I'm going to ignore for the moment, and I'm going to turn on multipass. So what multipass does allows me to see the different layers that I can render out as part of a multipass. Now, this says separate lights. It's not separate lights, it's separate the lights, which means I can choose to create different folders depending on how many lights I have. So let's take 2 lights, and I'm going to call one left and the other one right. Rig it. Right. And I can choose that this will separate all of the lights or just the one that I've got selected. So I could have lots of lights, but I only want 2 lights selected, and then it will only do selected. But I'm just going to choose all, which means it will create 2 folders, one for the left, one for the right. Then by default, I've got the 3 different modes that it will separate out into. One of which is diffuse, which is the color, the specular, which is how shiny it is, but we've discovered, of course, is a lie, and the shadow. You can choose to do 2 channels, which is the diffuse and specular together as one, and the shadow in another, or you can have 1 channel of all 3, which is absolutely no point in doing a multipass on, because you may as well just do a normal image. I am going to turn on shadow correction. So the one that I want here is 3 channels, diffuse, specular, and shadow. So 3 different channels will do my 3 different things that I can adjust. Then I'm going to go back to save, and you can see I've now got a multipass section as well as a save section. The save section will allow me to, as before, save a standard flat image, which some people do as what they call a beauty pass. And that means that you can reference, when you've finished faffing with all of the different levels, you can see the difference between the original pass and your beautifully, wonderfully recolor mapped composited image. For this, I'm just going to turn off regular image and minimize that to get rid of it. And then I'm going to just choose where I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to call this on my desktop Multipass. Lilu Dallas Multipass. You can see by default, thankfully, that it is created a PSD file format because it's a layered format, which is going to be really nice. What multi-layer file? 1 file with all of the layers on it. Absolutely perfect. So let's close that, and then let's press the render button and see what it does. I have this wonderful masterpiece, and now you can see from where we were looking earlier. So if I just look at my image, there is my image with my cone, my sphere, and my cube. There's the info, this is where I've put it, where I've saved it, how long it took, when it was done, what sort of color space. If I look under my layers, look at what we've got. We have 2 folders, one called left and one called right, because I separated the lights. And what I can do, if I choose multipass image here, I can remove shadows and lights if I don't want any of the shadows in either of my files. So it's kind of comping stuff over the top, which is really clever, and it gives you the ability of tweaking stuff and adding things and messing around with it, which is a nice little tweak to be able to get things to be the way you want them to be. But you can see that it sort of disappears, so it's a very odd image because it doesn't actually have the things that I need. I mean, there is my file, and if I load up Photoshop, which might take its time, I will be able to see that the different layers that I have available to me.
Also, while this is loading, a big shout out to Kent, because he was saying he's checked and you can have Z depth in standard renderer under the multipass options.
Ah, sweet. Thank you very much, Ken.
So yeah, I thought I'd share that with everyone.
That's cool. So you can see that with these options on, it doesn't actually have any of my reflection layers, which is a bit weird depending on what I do and don't have selected, even though that my preview does. That's using basically a fake depth map to figure it out, a fake beauty path to figure it out, because that information clearly is not in either of these. But what means we can do in Cinema 4D, under here, under Multipass, we can choose all sorts of lovely things that we can add in. So we can add in material color, and we can add in material transparency. We can add in material reflection. And then I can render again, and yes, it will overwrite and it will moan at me. Yes. And now I have material reflection and transparency and color, supposedly, all in different layers that I can tweak and add and overlay. And you can use them as image maps. Material color, that doesn't look right to me. Oh, is it because of the way I've rendered it? It's because I've used them in a physical way, doesn't it? Rather than, let's add reflection. Let's add, oh, you can also add, add ambient occlusion and global illumination on top as well, and you can see the difference that these things make. Diffuse, and then let's render again. Yes. So diffuse was irrelevant because it's made no difference, but material colors and the reflections that would work over the top, and then there is the reflection layer over the top of that. So it's quite nice to be able to increase and decrease all sorts of stuff. And you can see that all of a sudden that's getting less. And you can choose different blending layers and all those sorts of things so that you can separate out so many different elements of your image. And now let's say, okay, what if we wanted the cube in an entire separate layer? There's something that we can do. We can go to tags. We can go to compositing tag that we were using earlier. And under the object buffer at the very end, I can call that object buffer number 1. And then here in my render settings under my multipass, I will add an object buffer. And on this one, it's already set to 1 because it's the first number that we use. But what that does, that will create another layer called object buffer 1 that will allow me to separate that object out if I want to. It doesn't do the whole object because obviously it's got stuff blocking its way, but it does mean that you can use that as an alpha channel and delete other things and just see the cube. And that very quickly is multipass.
We don't have any questions. You've shown them
Awesome.
everything. You've answered them
Huzzah!
all.
That's it. You are all learned.
Everyone's an expert now. That's what it is after this 6 weeks.
That's it. Our jobs are now in jeopardy with all of these people going to come and steal it and teach cinema to people.
I'll retire now.
That's it. That's cool. Our job is done. Right. In which case, then, I'll throw the screen at you then.
Yes. Let's do it, and I will do a bit about Redshift. Right. Show my screen. Okay, cool. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so doing an introduction to Redshift, normally I would want to spend like quite a substantial amount of time. And so because we have kind of like 45 minutes, I'm going to basically, so this is one of the scenes we did last week in the MoGraph session, and I thought the best way to kind of show some of the possibilities and some of the stuff in Redshift would be to just kind of redo this scene how I would do it in Redshift. So I'm going to light it, I'm going to create some textures, and we're going to have a little look at the render settings. otherwise I'll be sort of showing you all the settings in Redshift, and it could take too much time. And this might be a more kind of exciting way, especially for those people who haven't used Redshift yet, just to do a little toe dip into it and see kind of the possibilities. Yeah. And so yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions on anything, and Matt will shout them out and we'll get to them. Cool. Right, so let me just move this out of the way. Right, okay, cool. So let me just grab, so this was actually the hero shot that I did end up rendering in Redshift for last week. So I've already got like my light set up, and so I'm just gonna copy everything over, and I'm gonna create a whole new scene. And then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go to the standard layout, because I have a lot of like the options on my toolbar. So let's leave it like this. So we're all looking at the same thing now. Okay, cool. And I'm just going to remove all of these textures. So we'll see how far we get with this. I don't want to rush through too much, but yeah, we may not end up kind of recreating the whole thing, but we'll see what we get to. So once we've all got Redshift installed, we can actually find it inside of our render settings. So Matt was just showing us our render settings up here. So he was showing us standard and physical. If you have Redshift installed or any other kind of third-party renderer, it will show up in this kind of drop-down menu here. And it's kind of best practice when you're creating a scene. Let's say I wanted to create a scene that I was going to render in Redshift. I'm going to change my renderer first, because it's going to give me in my render view or my IPR, it's going to give me a more accurate kind of representation of how it's going to look. So that's kind of like the main thing that you're going to want to do. We'll have a look at some of the render settings in a little bit, but for now, let's focus on kind of creating some stuff in our scene, creating some lights, creating some textures, and then we'll kind of have a look at some of the bits in the render settings. So the first thing I would normally do once I've kind of modeled and made my scene would be to start to light it. But before I do that, there's one thing I like to do. So some of the stuff I'm going to show you is my personal preference. Some of it will be kind of like best practice. So inside Redshift, we have two ways of seeing like a live render view or IPR, which is our progressive render. And the first way is we've got like this Redshift button up here. If we click that, we have this start IPR. And if I start my IPR, we now have our viewport has turned into our Redshift viewport, they call the viewport IPR, progressive renderer. So now I can create all the stuff in my viewport, and I can kind of, do what I need to do, and it's all happening live in here. That's fine. We can come back up and we can just click the start IPR again, and it will switch it off. So that's one way. There is a second way, which is the way that I tend to work. I prefer the render view. So to get our render view up, if we come up to our Redshift tab up here, so this is where we'll find all of our Redshift kind of stuff under this Redshift tab. And we have this Redshift render view. So we're going to have a look at some other bits in here as well. But for now, I'm going to grab my render view. And we have this second window that pops up. And so the reason I like to use the render view is I like to dock it. So in the very first week, whoever was there or whoever's seen the recording, Matt showed us how we can customize our layout. And so because this is a separate window inside of Cinema 4D, and we have access to these three little bars here, we can actually dock it inside of our main Cinema 4D kind of layout. So if I click and hold that, I'm just going to dock that here, so we can see we've got this little like sort of translucent white line, and that can be, that means you can dock it in any of these places. I'm going to put it here. And the reason I do this is because I like to do my work in my viewport, and I like to see it live in my render view as a separate sort of window. So we'll go through a couple of these buttons.
Which is all
So
very well and good when you're on a 28-inch iMac, but you know, when we're on a tiny laptop, that's why I don't bother.
yes, that's probably, yeah, an important thing to mention. I have got quite like a big screen that I'm working on, so I can take advantage of like the real estate inside of here. Yeah, I imagine if I wasn't, then I probably wouldn't do it. Cool. So this first button here, this is a full render. So the same as sort of we have a full render up here, this is the same button but inside of Redshift. We then have our start and stop IPR. So at the moment, because it's blue, it means my render view, my IPR are running. So if I start to do some things in here, start to move around, if I made some changes, it's going to update live in the second window, which is my render view. And we can just switch that off. And then what will happen is it's not going to update until I then start it again. We have a full kind of refresh here. So there are some things inside of Cinema 4D that Redshift doesn't necessarily kind of update in real time. So for example, like we've found recently that when we use the hair system, if we make changes to the hair system, Redshift Renderview requires you to do like a little refresh just so it can kind of recalculate all of the things that you're then doing with the hair system and or like the materials for the hair system. So that's what that can be for. This drop down here relates to, so Matt just showed us multipasses inside of like standard Cinema 4D. You can also set up multipasses in Redshift. So I can show you in the render settings in a little bit how we can set those up, but they're called AOVs. And if you set up some AOVs, for example, your reflections or your shadows or ambient occlusion, you also have the option to preview them here. So if I'd set one up, I could click it here and it's going to give me a render view of that particular AOV or multipass. So that can be quite handy. Click that. This button you may recognize because it looks similar to the button for the Cinema 4D version, and it is an interactive render region. And then we get this lovely render region up, and it's going to do exactly what the Cinema 4D one does. It's going to render that particular region. And a useful thing for this is if we have our render region active, we then have access to this mode here, which is bucket mode. So if I click that, what it's going to do, did I not? Oh, it'd be handy if I started the IPR. Then we can do a bucket mode, and it's going to do sort of like a full bucket render of that particular interactive render region. Right, let me just switch these bits off. So they're the only kind of settings I wanted to run through now. Yeah, let's get into making some lights. Cool, right. So I'm just going to run through how I originally lit this scene and then how I created some textures for it as well. Cool, right. So as we know, we have our Redshift tools up in this drop down here. So we have a bunch of different Redshift objects. So if anyone does any kind of material baking, you can do that with a Redshift bake set. You can drop a load of objects in there and then you can bake out textures for those. Redshift environment is useful if you're doing things like volumetric lighting. So if you're creating like fog or atmosphere, we can use the environment there. We have a Redshift sky. So a lot of this stuff quite nicely translates to the Cinema 4D version. So, Cinema 4D has a sun and sky rig or a sky. Redshift has the same thing, just with its own Redshift settings. I've not really messed with Redshift proxy or matrix scatter. Lights as well, all under here. So they have, again, similar names. So if I just sort of click that button here and then we click this one here. So, they kind of translate over. So, Matt showed us all these different light types inside of Cinema 4D. So I don't need to necessarily go through all these ones in Redshift, but this is just the Redshift version of those. One thing we are going to look at, which is how I often start when I light a scene, is a dome light. So before we were using a sky with a HDRI image inside of Cinema 4D. This is the Redshift equivalent. So what we're going to do, we're going to grab a dome light. And if I sort of come out of here, we have this plain white kind of infinite light lighting our scene. If we take a look inside our dome light, let me just pull this settings up here, we have access to a whole bunch of settings for this particular light. So first of all, we can, if we decide that actually we didn't want a dome light, we can just change that here. And then here is where we can add a HDR image. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to come up to my asset browser. I'm going to search HDR. And so before, when it came to using the Cinema 4D Sky, we needed to grab a material with a HDR image loaded into the Luminance channel. However, for the Redshift dome light, we don't need to grab this material. We only want the .hdr file. So let me grab one of these. I think it was just this one. So I'm just going to simply drag and drop that into the path. And we can see it's updated in here. I sort of come into here. We can see that we're now getting some lighting. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to rotate my dome light because it's looking a little bit dark at the moment. So I'm going to get it so we've got some light coming in at the front. There we go. Cool. Right. So this color space is actually a new feature. I think in either this latest release of Redshift or maybe just kind of like one before, ACES is now included. And so we now have this color space, and we're now able to now choose the color space for our our dome light, as well as like our color management and stuff like that. So if I choose like sRGB, that's kind of like the normal that I would go for this HDRI image. And then we can change things like our gamma, exposure, hue. So if we had a HDR that had a bit of like a color tint on it, you can adjust the hue. I mean, this has only got white, so that won't make any changes. And we can also adjust our saturation, or we can choose to tint it from here if we wanted to. That's not something I'm going to do. Cool. So some of the other useful tabs, because yeah, as I said, I don't want to spend too much time going through absolutely everything. If you're doing volumetric lighting, for example, fog, you'll often need to add a contribution scale on your lights, whether that's a dome light, your area lights, or anything. And this is where you would adjust those settings. Yeah, if we don't want our lights to be showing in things like our reflections, but we want them to be lighting our scene, but maybe not showing, maybe we have like a whole bunch of area lights and it's creating some weird reflections on some glass, we can actually switch off effects specular, and so that will prevent that from happening. We can also switch off our shadows if we want to. So perhaps if you were doing maybe like some product lighting, if you have a 3-point lighting setup, you may not want 3 different angles of shadow. You may just want maybe your, I don't know, your key light causing shadow. So you could switch off your shadow of like the fill and the rim. And then we also have access to this same project setting, which we have in the Cinema 4D lights as well. So you can include and exclude things from these lights. But I'm going to leave that for now. Okay, cool. Right, let me just go into my Voronoi fracture, and I'm just going to switch off colorized fragments.
I've got a very quick question for you.
Yes.
Can you, Jonathan's asking, can you vary the resolution of the Redshift render view, or is it fixed as is?
Oh, yes, you can. Oh.
So you can change the quality, can't you? I'm just trying to remember how. Is it sample settings somewhere?
So you can do it like kind of by adjusting the actual render settings, but I'm pretty sure there is. Here we go. So you can do it inside of this IPR. I believe you can change the undersampling. Let me switch this off, switch that on. Yeah. So we can then So this is sort of like a quality scale here, undersampling. I'm not sure where to do it in the Renderview, but this is how you can do it if you're using like the Viewport IPR.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out where that's hidden in the not that.
No. No, I mean the inside, we'll look at this in a sec, but inside the actual render settings, this will make a difference as well. So at the moment I've got my raises really low. If I'd increase this, it would also increase the quality in my render view. So that's another way of doing it.
Cool, thank you.
No worries. Let me turn my settings off now. No, actually, you know what? We'll leave them up. We'll leave them up. Oh, right, cool. Okay, cool. Right, so I'm going to. What am I going to do now? So yeah, I also added a couple of area lights as well. So I'm going to leave my dome light as it is because it's just creating some nice overall lighting for my scene. And now I'm going to kind of fill some of these darker areas and create some more kind of dramatic shadows by adding some area lights. So I'm going to switch that off for now. So inside our lights, we have, as we've seen, a whole bunch of different lights in here, and we're gonna take advantage of some area lights. And my whole scene's gonna go dark, and that's because we've added in a huge area light, and I've just pulled that out. And if I play this, it's gonna be super bright. So let's have a look at our area light settings. So let me pull this across so we can see these a little better. Okay, so we're taking a look at our area light now, and inside here we have a load of different settings, and let's like really quickly run through them, and then we can get to sort of creating some materials and having a look at nodes. So first of all, we have our mode, and we have three different types. You have color, temperature, and temperature and color. So on color, we have access to this like color picker, and so we can choose the color of our light. So at the moment, because this is because it's super bright, it may not. Yeah, it's so bright at the moment we can't. I hope you can see that tint basically. You know, I can turn my intensity down just so we can see it. We also have temperature. So you know we can have like a cool light or a warm light. So we can come and we can get sort of like an orangey red tint versus kind of like this this bluer tint. Or we have a mix between the two, and it's going to sort of do like a blend between those colors. I'm going to leave it on color, and I'm just going to put it back on its default. Again, we can add a texture and adjust our color space in here if we wanted to. Intensity multiplier is exactly the same as the intensity of a light in Cinema 4D. So we can adjust the intensity of our light. So I've dropped this down to 10. And the reason I've done that is because at the moment my light is very big. So it's 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters. And that is that means that it's creating even more light. So it's kind of that intensity is relating to the size of the light as well. But there is a way that we can prevent that from happening. We also have an exposure setting, and then we also have our fall off type. So by default, inverse square is your most physically accurate, but you also have access to none or linear. And if you have linear, you can adjust the fall off start and stop centimeters. We have the shape. So if I just come out of here, so we can see the light. So at the moment we have this rectangle, and we get a nice like wireframe in our viewport, so we can see this exact size of this light. And then we could adjust this, you know, we can have a sphere, and this will give us like light in all directions of the sphere. Or we can choose mesh, and then you can put in like an object inside of there or a different shape. So maybe a cylinder or something, you could drop it into that that path, kind of file path there. So let me just reduce the size of this light a little bit. And what you might notice is if I sort of play that, is we're now getting a less intense light. So I haven't adjusted the intensity, but I adjusted the size. So if I put this on something like 500 and 500, we can see we're getting a more intense light versus if I put it on a 10 by 10. And so this is an important thing to know, but there is a way of preventing the size of the light from having an effect on the intensity, and that is this normalized intensity. So if I check that, now the only thing that's going to make a difference is our intensity multiplier. I'm just going to switch that off. Two more settings really quickly before we kind of put these where we'd want them is at the moment we can't see this light in our render view, but there may be some instances where you may want to see some visible light. For example, if you, I don't know, had like a light bulb or like a light panel on the ceiling. And we can just check on this visible option and we can now see that we have it in our render view. And so this is the front of my light. So this is the side that is casting light. So if we have a look at the back, we have this, we have no light being cast on the back. And that is this second option, bidirectional. Now what we're getting is we're getting light in both directions, and we can also see it. We could still have it not visible and still have bidirectional if we wanted to. Right, cool. So that's pretty enough about those settings. Just doing a little time check. Okay, cool. Right, so let me quickly add let me just switch this off. So the same as in the sky, when you don't want to see the image in the background. So at the moment we can see this HDRI image. Inside of the dome light, we don't have to worry about doing like the comp settings. We can just come into the dome light and we can switch off the backplate enabled. We can just sort of have that. So we now have this like this black preview instead. Right, so what I'm going to do quickly, I'm just going to create a camera because I want to show you a quick little trick that's going to help when kind of adjusting lights in your scene. So there are two different ways that we could create a camera. I could create a standard Cinema 4D camera, as we've done, and then you can right click and then we can come to Redshift Camera, drop a Redshift Camera Tag on there. Or slightly quicker way is coming into the Redshift menu and then going under cameras and then going to standard, and then we're going to get the same thing. And we've got our Redshift Camera Tag here. Cool, so let's position this where we'd like it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to zero out. This is a little trick that I do to get a nice kind of a nice camera angle on something that I've created that's like centered. So I'm just going to zero out my position and I'm going to zero out my rotation. And let me just switch my render view off for now. And so now I have my camera exactly at 0. So what I can do now, I can just pull it out and let's have a little look through it, see where we're at. Maybe a little bit more. Cool, and so it's gonna be nice and like centered now. Maybe I can just drop it down slightly. Okay, so the reason I've set up this camera is because I want to rearrange my lights, but I also want to see, I want to find an easy way of rearranging my lights, but I also want to see how it's looking on my my final camera angle, my final kind of render. And so if I start my render view, if I come out of my camera, it's going to mess up my render view, but this is how I want to adjust my lights. So what we can do in this little drop down here, we have access to a bunch of different options, one of which is the RS camera we just added. So if I click RS camera, my render view is now giving me my proper camera angle, but my viewport is allowing me to kind of work as normal and kind of readjust things and move my lights, because I find it's an easier way of doing that without having to mess with my camera angle at all. So that's a nice little tip there. So let me just rearrange this area light. So what I'm going to do, I love to target my area lights because I find it way easier than kind of rotating them. So I'm going to grab a null. I'm just going to center it out, and this is going to become my target for my light. I'm going to right click my area light, and this is where we can take advantage of our Cinema 4D tags. And so we had a look at the target tag in one of the previous weeks, and that's under our animation tags. So if we just grab a target tag, we then have our target object, which can be our null. And now when I move my area light, it's going to be always facing and targeting that null. So yeah, that's my that's my lazy cheat way of targeting lights. And then all I'm going to do is duplicate this area light, because I'd like a second option. And what I'm doing here, I'm positioning them here, but I'm looking at how it's looking in my render view. So yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. And then when we start to add some textures, we can see if we need to make any changes to these lights. Right, so let's get into materials, because we are rapidly running out of time. Right, so let's get in here. So we're going to create, the first thing we're going to do, we're going to create this inside texture of our Voronoi fracture, because it's super simple and it's just using the standard Redshift material node. Cool, so when it comes to creating Redshift materials, it is a node-based system. So we don't have access to kind of the lovely channels that we do in the standard material editor. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab myself a standard Redshift material. I did that, I've come under create, we go to Redshift, materials, and then we have a standard material. I'm going to grab that, and then we get this RS material. And so I'm going to double click this, and this is, for anyone who hasn't seen it before, this is the Redshift shader graph. So this is sort of the node editor inside of Redshift. Really quickly, I'm going to do a bit of a comparison between the two. So let me grab a new standard material. This is the Cinema 4D one. I'm just going to open it up just so I can do a comparison between the Redshift shader graph and the Cinema 4D material editor. So when you create a standard Redshift material, you get two nodes already in your shader graph, which are going to help you out. So the first node is this Redshift material, and we're going to take a look at the settings in a sec. And the second node is an output. In every material, you will have an output, because this is your final output for the surface of your material, which then will be on your object or anything inside of Cinema 4D. So when we look at the Redshift material node, which is this one here, we have a whole bunch of tabs and a whole bunch of settings. And I'm going to try and kind of compare the two, the shader graph materials and the material editor together, just to kind of maybe help explain exactly what does what. So the first option we have, so we're going to ignore preset for now, but we will get to that. So we have this diffuse option, and the diffuse is the same as our color channel. So we can just change the color of our material, and we have this live preview up here, which is super handy. So this is the place where you're going to change the color of your diffuse. A lot of settings inside of the shader graph have this weight option, and this weight goes from a value of 0 to 1. 0 is a 0% value, whereas 1 is 100% value. So at the moment, because our diffuse weight is set to 1, we have 100% diffuse of that color. If I set it to 0, we have 0% of that color on our texture. Or we can do 0.5, roughly 0.5, which is then a 50% weight of that. So I'm going to leave that on 1 now, because I want the color to be affected. We then have a roughness, but I wouldn't worry about roughness inside of the diffuse setting. I would focus on adjusting those things in the reflection. So diffuse, color, sort of go hand in hand. Let's come down to reflection. So this is our reflectance channel. So we have the color of our reflection, which we can change. Let's do like a red so we can see it. And so now we can see that our reflection is red. Again, we have this weight option. So let me just set that back to white. So if we put that down to 0, we have no reflection at all. So we effectively have like 100% diffuse material. If I put that back onto 1, we then have a roughness slider. So we can sort of start to increase this and we start to get, you know, a slightly rougher reflection all the way up to a value of 1. Again, gets us a kind of almost 100% diffuse material. BRDF, so these are similar to the options we have in here. There are just not as many. So Beckman, GGX, and a Schickman Shirley. I'm going to be totally honest, I have never used the last one, so I cannot advise on that at all. But the general rule is if you're creating metals, the same as in Cinema 4D, GGX is your kind of default BRDF for metals, and Beckman is pretty much everything else. So that's the way I look at it. And then the next setting, so when you're creating your materials, in here is where you want to, once you know the material you're creating, these are the settings that you're going to want to change before you then go and start messing with kind of adding textures, adding bump, adding all the other nodes that you'll need eventually for your material. And this is another option you're going to want to be looking at as well. So, you know, naturally, if you're creating a transparent material, you're going to want a Beckman with an IOR, and then you're going to adjust your IOR. If you want something that's maybe like a metal, we're going to go GGX, either color, edge and tint, or metalness. And in here, you can adjust some of these settings. This also, when you change these settings, gives you different inputs for your material, which we're going to look at in a little bit. Okay, so refraction. So we had a look at reflection. Now we're looking at refraction. So sheen, really quickly, is like a fake Fresnel that you can add on there if you wanted to. We're not looking at subsurface scattering. Right, so refraction is our transparency. So if we take a look at our material up the top here, we have this weight value, which default is at 0. If I start to bring this up, we're starting to get a transparent material. So I have the wrong settings on. So let me do IOR. There we go. So yeah, so this is the same as our kind of transparency in here. And we can adjust, you know, the weight. And we can also do like a thin walled option, which gives you sort of like a bit of like a bubble, like it's more of like a thin, as opposed to like being like a solid material. Right, let me just reset everything to default. Did that reset all? There we go. So the only other thing I wanted to show is inside of overall, so the same as our luminance channel or our glow, we have this emission option. And so if I kind of make this, I don't know, a bright pink, and then I put an emission weight of maybe 3, we get this nice kind of emissive glowing material. So cool. Right, let's reset it to default. And let's create a couple of textures really quickly. Okay, cool. So the first texture I created really simply was just this orange texture. So all I did for this was adjusting my diffuse color. So I'm going to be really lazy. I'm going to use my color picker and I'm going to grab the same color. And yeah, texture number 1 done. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to drop this on my Voronoi fracture. I'm going to play my render view. And again, I just need to mess with my selections. So I want this to be my inside faces. So that is now our inside faces. Let me just switch these off. Cool. Right, so my second material, which one should we do first? Let's do this gold. Let's do the gold. So I'm going to create another new Redshift material. And for this gold texture here that I did, I actually just used one of the presets. So the nice thing about Redshift is we have a whole bunch of presets in here, which, you know, they're great on their own, but they're also a great starting point. And so I just grabbed the gold preset. And then what I'm going to do, so we can see this working, I'm going to undock my render view. So this is where I'm starting to run out of space now. And I'm going to just drop this on my cube. Right, kick that off. Right, so we have this gold texture now on some of our cubes in our background. But at the moment it's not looking great. Like it's super shiny, it's super reflective. And so I could come and mess with the roughness, but we can actually use a black and white or a grayscale texture map to create some like interesting imperfections quite easily. So inside my asset browser, so this asset browser is full of so much. I use it a lot. I'm not gonna lie. I take a lot of stuff from it. We have this smudges, or we have like scratches or kind of like greeble maps that we can use, and these black and white maps we can use to plug into our textures. So let me just grab this first one here, as this is the texture we have, and I'm going to use this texture to control this roughness value. And so what's going to happen, everything that is 100% white is going to be a value of 1, and so is going to be rough. Everything that is 100% black is going to be a value of 0, and therefore is going to be shiny. And so what we can do, we can plug this texture into here. And so inside of our RS material, we have a whole bunch of different inputs, but don't let that kind of scare you or put you off. All it is just these settings in here, kind of written in a text way. So, you know, we have our diffuse color, weight and roughness, which is our diffuse color, weight and roughness. That's all that is. So you can choose how you want to plug, what you want to plug it into. And because I want to control my roughness, all I need to do is click and hold and drop that in there. And we can adjust our reflection roughness. And now we get this really kind of interesting result. So that is now being mapped onto our texture, and the black and white texture map is controlling our roughness values between 0 and 1. So we have some areas that are shiny and some areas that aren't, and the kind of the gray areas are going to be kind of like a mid value of them. I'm sort of time checking myself. We may not get this finished today, but hey, it's a couple of bits about Redshift which hopefully come in handy. Are there any questions before I, you know me, I get carried away?
Yeah, there are a few questions.
Yeah, cool.
I'm just trying to go back to where it was. I'm now just trying to read where it was, what it was. I've completely lost where the questions were. Well, that was clever of me, wasn't it? Well done. Just like completely lost the window. Someone did ask, how easy is it to convert from a normal material to a Redshift material?
Okay, so this is quite an interesting topic. The physical conversion process is easy. It's as simple as kind of going to the settings, you can convert your materials. Let me have a look. So we can go to I don't know where it is now. Texture. Right, let me go up here and do it up here. Materials, and then we have tools, and then we have convert all materials, convert and replace materials, convert to node. We have a whole bunch of converting kind of processes. So convert all materials, what it's going to do, it's going to convert all of your materials to Redshift materials, and then you'll get both options. So you'll have your Cinema 4D materials in your material manager, as well as a Redshift version. convert and replace all materials will, as it says, it will convert them all to Redshift materials, but it will replace them all. Therefore, it will replace them all in your objects manager as well as your material manager. Converting to nodes will convert to Cinema 4D scene nodes. And then these two options will be the same, but replacing. The conversation about converting is, so when we create materials in Cinema 4D in a physical way, we layer up the channels, we layer up the things inside of the reflectance channel, right? The trouble is when we're converting, Redshift has no way of splitting out those layers. And so if you're creating materials in a physical way and you convert it over to Redshift, it will not convert them properly. Hands down, it won't do that because it's unable to see those layers. So if you have like layered noises, layered reflectance channels, it will not be able to separate them into the different nodes. If everything's like on an individual layer, so for example, if you had let's say you had a texture in the color channel, this is in Cinema 4D standard materials. If you had a texture in the color channel and then you had like a noise in the bump channel, that would convert properly because it's separate channels and it's separate layers. And so that would come across pretty accurately. Yeah, so not everything converts across. So I would kind of, sometimes it's a case of you can convert it and then you could then edit in the shader graph. So, you know, you could do the stuff that you could then add your layers inside the shader graph. But sometimes it is just easier to recreate the material in the shader.
That's my normal workflow. As I am personally, I'm still learning Redshift, and sometimes I think I'm not sure which nodes I need to use. So I'll make the material in Cinema and then I'll convert and I'll see what it's done, and then I'll figure out the bits that didn't quite work. It's quite a nice way to kind of get to know the node system without having to quite know all of it to start with. So I sneak and cheat in my way that way.
Yeah.
We've got a couple more questions.
Yeah, sure.
How would we go about doing multipasses in Redshift, and also how to do a Z depth pass in Redshift?
Okay, so I actually linked to a tutorial by Wimbush who goes through how to do a Z depth path in Redshift.
Okay.
So that should be in the chat because I don't know how to do that, but I can show how we set up multipasses. So inside, let me just go into my render settings. So inside my render settings, so by default, it will look like this. So if your Redshift doesn't look like this, you may want to upgrade to 3.044 at least, because there's a whole new UI change and it is the best thing Redshift has ever done. It is so user-friendly now. We have this basic tab. So for anyone that's new to using Redshift, we have like sort of presets of like low, medium, high, very high, and this is the quality of your render, and you don't really have to worry about doing much else. So yeah, if you're on maybe an older version of Redshift, I'd recommend upgrading. Cool, right, let's have a look at the advanced tab. So in our advanced tab, we have this AOV option, and these are our multipasses. So let me, oh, here we go. This looks like the Z depth thing here. So if we go to our show AOV manager, so this looks a little bit similar to when Matt was showing us, you know, the multipasses option in here. They're just sort of here. So what we do is we just drag and drop the pass that we want. We have multipass. We can have a direct pass. And so what this will do is we'll have a direct file of ambient occlusion. We can then have a look inside of here. We can set our name. We can choose, you know, like the file path name, and then we can choose the format and everything within here. And so once we do something like that, we then, if we grab our render view up, so this is what I was saying earlier, you actually have access to doing an AO pass. So that's how you would set up your multipasses inside of Redshift. Just go to AOV manager and then drag and drop whatever ones that you're after, really. And then yeah, you just choose your format and choose your settings inside of there. Any others?
Thank you for that.
That's okay.
I can't find the Wimbush thing that you were sent. I was just scouring the chat, but
So if have a quick look on YouTube to who is interested, and just have a look on Wimbush, and he's done Redshift Cinema 4D with After Effects, creates the depth path, and yeah, he's extremely knowledgeable.
okay, cool, thank you. And in which case that might answer the next question, which is the one I was about to ask. Could you show your workflow for controlling depth of field with the Redshift camera?
Yeah, sure. This probably isn't the best scene to do it, but you know what, we'll do it. I'm just going to do a better angle so I can really get to this. So let me get right in here. Okay, cool. Right, so right, okay, so the way I would do it is, let me just dock this so we can see what's going on. Click that off, make sure everything's all good. Yep. Right, so what I do, so I'm coming into my, let me just create a new camera because I wasn't on the camera. Right, I'm gonna grab a standard Redshift camera, looking through that. Right, so a couple of steps. First things first is to control our focus distance. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be a little bit lazy and grab this little mouse button here, and then I'm just going to click where I want my focus distance to be. So let's go for this. And then I'm going to come into my Redshift camera tag. And I'm going to come over to bokeh, and we're going to override it, and we're going to enable it. And then I'm going to go to focus distance. And then now we can already see we're getting this depth of field happening. And then we can adjust our COC radius. So we can get some really kind of dramatic depth of field, or we can go, you know, really nice and low in here. And it's nice, and it's going to show in our render view. And yeah, and then we can continue to adjust our focus distance if we want to, or you can set a focus object just like you would in like standard Cinema 4D. It's just the camera tag settings that I tend to adjust. Yeah, that's my personal workflow for using depth of field in Redshift, and it's quite nice. You know, we can see it's pretty cool. So my plan was to show so much more in Redshift, but there is so much to show. Yes. But are there any other questions? Like, but yeah, but I think I don't know if like we can say, but well, I mean, we're probably gonna do a Redshift version of this hands-on workshop.
So that's something for you guys to look forward to. What was one quick question? I don't know if it would be a quick answer. What would be the Redshift version of the object buffer that I showed in with the compositing tag and being able to single out individual objects using the object buffer? Is there a way of doing that in Redshift as well under AOVs?
Oh, I've definitely had this question before as well. Oh, okay, right. So as in just to like render out specific
so that you can create
objects.
alpha channels for individual objects, yeah, in a scene.
So I'm trying to think, because you could do custom AOVs, and then could you customize it?
If you add I've just looked, if you add a Redshift tag to an object, not a camera tag, just a Redshift object tab, there is an object ID and an object ID override, so you can set it that way. I'm assuming you would then have some form of object ID, AOV.
Yes, and then you go into the AOV, and then we have the object ID right. Yeah.
There we go. And you can do it that way. And we have 1 minute to spare.
I know. Oh, do you know what? I had so much that I wanted to show, but an introduction to Redshift, yeah, in 45 minutes is very
Is
challenging.
short, yes.
Yes, but if anyone has any like questions on Redshift, then please feel free, like outside of this workshop, just to fire them over, and I'll be like absolutely more than happy to answer them. Yeah, whenever or whatever you guys need. And yeah, I mean, I've said it now, haven't I? So it's happening. But we'll do a Redshift version of this because I think a lot of people have requested that. Also, quickly, while we do like a wrap up, if there are any other kind of what's the word, things you would like to see, topics, that's the word, any other topics you'd
The other
like,
thing.
help me, my brain, it's been 2 hours. Yes, any other topics that you guys would like to do, just to kind of like for us to do this hands-on stuff, whether it's us, whether it's some of the other team. Yeah, we're really keen to do a lot more of this kind of this format, after everyone's feedback. Like everyone seems really positive. Also let us know if there's anything else you'd like maybe done differently. Like we always love like constructive feedback as well, so these are as good for you as they possibly can be. So yeah, really quickly in the chat, let us know if it's Redshift. I know someone mentioned like a whole MoGraph one, and I would absolutely love to do that. So yeah, if there's any things, and I will share it with the team, and we'll kind of get through those. Right, so I guess we can do a little recap, little final.
Yeah.
So also I wanted to say thank you. Thanks to Matt for like the last 6 weeks. Like everything you've shown is amazing, and all like the feedback, everyone is so kind of positive about the way that you explain things, and like the technical kind of stuff that you know. It is amazing, and it's been such a pleasure kind of doing these with you. And also a big thank you to everyone who's watching us live and with us live, whether it's you've been here 1 week, 2 weeks, or all 6 weeks. You really have made it, like me and Matt say, it's so great how interactive these are, all the questions, all the tips that you guys kind of share as well. It's been like really nice having this little kind of like 6-week community going on. Like I don't know if you feel the same, Matt, but I think it's been really,
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed it. It's been
really
completely different stuff we've done before.
No, it's been really nice to kind of see people's progress as well, because it's like we keep seeing things pop up on Instagram and I think we recognize that.
Yeah.
It's been really nice. So yeah, just let us know, if you can think of other things that you guys would like us to figure out, then yeah, let us know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so, and again, thank you to everyone who watches the recordings as well. Like big shout out to you guys. I know, like time zone wise, like not it isn't suitable for everyone, but we do appreciate, yeah, the people who do either get up early or kind of take the time out of their time to be here with us as well. And so a little recap. So in week 1, for anyone who maybe wasn't part of that session, we looked at how to navigate around Cinema 4D. We learned about primitives and how we can kind of change them and mess with them using deformers. In week 2, we went into like beginner modeling techniques. So looked at like splines and generators, as well as a bit of an intro to box and STS modeling. Week 3, we dove into looking at lighting and also how to create some of our own materials inside of Cinema 4D's like sort of in a standard and a physical way. Week 4, we dove into animating, how to animate in keyframes, things like auto keying, as well as looking at our dynamics, in particular like rigid and collider body. Week 5, which is no secret, was my favorite week. We looked at MoGraph, so cloner, Voronoi fracture, and then effectors and fields. And then, as we all know, week 6, we looked at rendering and a brief bit of Redshift. And so if anyone kind of missed any of those weeks, I've linked a couple of times in the questions and in the chat the link to those recordings. And so if you're seeing some of this stuff and you think, oh, I missed that one, I'd really be kind of keen to learn that stuff, then definitely, yeah, just like jump on that YouTube playlist. And that's not going anywhere. It's not going to be like we're only leaving it for 4 weeks. I imagine it'll be there indefinitely. And it's all time stamped as well. So, if you want to skip through my rambling, you're more than welcome to.
It's been wonderful to see your thought process and everything that you've done. So thank you very much, Elly, for taking everything that I've done and explained, and then making really cool stuff that people can then be proud of afterwards.
No,
So once again,
I've
yeah,
loved it. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So yeah, normally I say this says see you next week, and I'm devastated that it's not.
that's it. See you soon. Take care, everybody, and thank you very much.
Yeah, have a good one, everyone.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.